All right, well, thanks so much for having me. This is a great opportunity for me to talk about the things that I think about, not all the time, but a lot of the time. I think it's really interesting. This is very much interdisciplinary or cross-disciplinary work. So hopefully this will be of interest to people from all kinds of backgrounds, philosophers, neuroscientists, computer scientists. We'll see. I think it's interesting. I hope to convince you it's interesting too. So let me tell you about some of the main questions that I'm interested in. First, the big general question, what is computation? One thing philosophers do, I don't know if we're good at it, but we do it, is ask big general questions. Also, I'd like to know what kinds of things compute. There is a very obvious answer to this, and then there's a more subtle answer. And then get into part of why you're here, what analog computation is. And then finally, I'll end up talking a little bit about, I'm not going to answer the question, is the brain an analog computer? But I'm going to maybe help stimulate some thoughts about what it would mean for it to be an analog computer. So first of all, what is computation? There are three general kinds of computation you can find out there. The first is digital computation. This is the kind of thing that some of us know how this works. We're all familiar with it because it's the kind of computation that is used in our smartphones, our laptops, this laptop right here, Fitbits, etc. We can go a little bit more theoretical and look at Turing computation. This is a sort of mathematical theory of computation that provides a lot of, well, maybe all of the theoretical underpinnings of digital computation. Then there's also analog computation, and this is something that's the least well understood. So I'm going to spend just a little bit of time talking about the first two, mainly as a way of comparing and contrasting it with analog computation, which will be the bulk of the talk. So again, what is computation? Here is just an image of some people doing some maintenance on a digital computer. This happens to be a supercomputer. And this is a computation that's really well understood. This is the vast majority of what computer scientists and computer engineers study. So one thing that they do, you might know that digital computers at the sort of bottom level, everything is ones and zeros, right? But there are a lot of layers of abstraction on top of that. But at the very bottom level, we want to know how to manipulate those ones and zeros to do other things. So this is, the details here don't matter, you won't be quizzed. But this is just a kind of schematic of how we can use 32 ones and zeros to represent a real number. This is a single precision floating point number. If you're a nerd like me, you know what that means. If you're not, who cares? And this is just a schematic of how the circuitry involved if we want to multiply two numbers in that format. So computer engineers and computer scientists spend a lot of time making these things more efficient, and then also worrying about how can we make those ones and zeros represent other things, to ultimately represent, the pixel on your digital photo, or words on a word processor, or the position of your cursor, right? Things like that. We can go a little bit more abstract, a little more general, and talk about Turing computation. And this is just my shorthand for a bunch of different things in theoretical computation. Most people these days have heard of Alan Turing. He's gotten some press because of popular movies. And a lot of people know he was the one who really gave birth to theoretical computer science. He published this paper in 1936 on computable numbers, where he was interested in thinking about what is it that can be computed, and by that he meant something very specific. He meant, what's the kind of thing that a person can do with pencil and paper, just following very basic rules? The kind of thing, what he had in mind was really a job description. This was mostly a job that women held. This is a particularly famous human computer, Katherine Johnson, who worked at NASA, one of the subjects of the movie Hidden Figures. And these people had the job of just performing computations. Pencil and paper, following rules, and it's something we're all familiar with. Hopefully this is not news to anyone, but digital computation is essentially the way we've learned how to do additions when we were in elementary school, right? So Turing noted the way you solve this problem is you look at one symbol and you remember it, got a 3 in your head, and you look at another symbol, 2, and you've memorized this rule. Oh, write down a 5, right? And then you just keep doing that for the next symbols. 2 and 7 is 9, and then the next symbols, then you have the answer, right? So this is what we do. This is what Turing used as the basis for his idea of computation, except he formalized it in this very easy to understand mathematical language here, right? And the work that he did eventually became known as the Turing machine. And it's really just a mathematical abstraction of what we do, moving one symbol around one at a time in very, very simple operations. But combine a lot of those operations and you can do all sorts of things. But the one thing that Turing didn't consider, and this is not a shortcoming of Turing, this is just not what he was interested in at the time, is what can be done by human computers using things like slide rules. And this brings us to the idea of analog computation. The problem is, when we're looking toward analog computation, it's not as well theoretically understood as Turing computation, and I'll say more about that in a little bit. Here's a nice quotation from a friend of mine who wrote a book on physical computation, and he says, "Analog computation is often contrasted with digital computation, although it's a vaguer and more slippery concept. Roughly, analog computers are those systems whose function is to manipulate continuous variables, variables that can vary continuously over time, and take any real values within certain intervals specified by differential equations, so as to instantiate appropriate functional relationships between the variables." Kind of a mouthful, but this is roughly the idea. A lot of people think in terms of this kind of so-called analog-digital dichotomy, right? Where the idea is the digital stuff is in chunks, ones and zeros, discrete steps, where the analog varies smoothly, right? And that's what he's saying here, just in, some philosophical jargon. So those are some answers for what kinds of computation could there be, what is computation. The other thing that's really interesting to me is looking carefully at what kinds of things compute. And there's a really obvious answer. There are those things that we design to be computers, artifacts, right? It's not confusing. What is a computer? It's those things we build to be computers, right? But also, some scientists claim that there are natural computers. What I mean by that is things that purportedly compute, they perform computations, but we didn't design them to do that. They're objects in nature. And there are very few things that scientists really think do this. One very important one, part of the subject of this talk, which is the human brain and the human mind. So let me just give you some examples. This is a very famous neuroscientist, Christoph Koch. He's now at the Allen Institute, doing very important work with large-scale neuroscience projects. And in this seminal book of his called The Biophysics of Computation, very first page, the very first line, he excitedly exclaims, "The brain computes," right? And he means that literally. Now, there are other people that say similar things. These two guys, London and Hauser, they have a very important piece in the Annual Review of Neuroscience, and the very first line on the first page of their article, they're much more sober. They say, "Brains compute," right? It's not just these two. If you go through and look at journal articles, these are just some ones that I pulled up today from just the last year or two. Here's one from Nature Communications, "The Neural Computation of Inconsistent Choice Behavior." So they're looking at what's happening in the human brain when we're doing these various choice tasks, right? And they say, the neural computation. Here's another one. "High-degree neurons feed cortical computations." So they're talking about computations that happens in the cortex. Along similar lines, "Looking for the roots of cortical sensory computation in 3-layered cortices." And last one, tracking the flow of hippocampal computation. Hippocampus is a part of the brain that's responsible for memory, and they're looking at the computations that the hippocampus performs. So I'll say more about this in a little bit, but these neuroscientists are really claiming that the brain is literally computing things, and that's a little bit mysterious. But the idea goes back quite some time. In the 40s, there's a very influential paper by Warren McCulloch and Walter Pitts called A Logical Calculus of the Ideas Immanent in Nervous Activity. They tried to compare different aspects of neural networks, the actual things in your brain, with logical circuits as they were understood at the time. An even more famous figure, perhaps, is John von Neumann. Von Neumann was one of the people responsible for the basic design of modern architectures and computers, is the von Neumann architecture. And one of the last things that he published was this book on the computer and the brain, noticing ways that the brain is similar and dissimilar to a computer. So it's an idea that has some pedigree. Now, this is the cartoon, right? This is a brain, if you didn't know. And in some way, it's like a computer, or it is a computer. And as a philosopher, this is where we really dig our teeth into this stuff. What's the right way to understand this relationship? Because it's very different to say the brain is like a computer than to say that it is a computer. Those are different claims, and they're importantly different claims, but they're the kinds of things that, if you aren't careful about these distinctions, you might not think that there is a distinction or realize that there is one. But then the question is, well, I just went over these different kinds of computation. What kind of computer is the brain, if we're going to take that claim literally? So let me say a little bit more about what I'm not talking about, just as a kind of matter of contrast. So there is computational simulation versus computational explanation. And I am not talking about simulation. So let me give you an example. Pick your favorite science and prepend the word computational to it, and there are people doing that. So, for example, on the top here, that is a computational simulation of a tornado. It's computational meteorology, which is actually most of meteorology now. This is a computational simulation of two stars orbiting each other, and the various colored lines are, I believe, gravitational fields. This is a computational simulation of a DNA molecule that's being heated up to the point where it's starting to denature or kind of come apart, right? And you can see how that's kind of wiggling and doing that. And then this is a computational simulation of just a brain cell, just what it looks like, its tree-like structure, right? So it's not news or surprising or mysterious that scientists use computation to understand things all the time. They use computational simulations. But the thing is, nobody says that just because we can simulate a tornado, the tornado's doing what it's doing because it's performing computations. No one says a tornado is a computer. Or no one says that a DNA molecule is a computer. Or these spinning stars are doing what they're doing because they're computing. But people do say that about minds and brains in psychology and neuroscience. They don't just mean you can simulate it with a computer, like those articles I just showed you. They say it is computing, right? And so, to make it really explicit, just because you can simulate some phenomenon that you're interested in science computationally, it doesn't mean that that thing performs computations. If you object to this, we can talk about that in the Q&A. But because there are some people that think that everything in the world computes, the whole universe is a giant computer. To me, that's a weird view, but whatever. But to say that a thing, something P, some scientific thing you're interested in computes, it does imply that the thing performs computations. And like I said, this is a little bit mysterious because we've got a good grip on building things that perform computations. But just saying, oh, there's this thing out in nature, this nervous system, and it's performing computations too, but we didn't build it to do that. that requires a little bit of hard thought. So now let me switch gears a little bit and just talk about analog computers, because I think this is very much a neglected aspect of computation. Very few people know much about analog computers these days, and perhaps for, well, reasons. I don't know if they're good reasons, but it's the truth. So here's the kind of received view. This is what philosophers like to call the idea that everybody has, if they even have an idea about analog computers. The idea is that analog computation essentially uses continuous as opposed to discrete or digital variables to solve continuous problems of interest. So again, that analog-digital dichotomy, the analog is the stuff that varies smoothly and continuously. So historically, there were three types of analog computers, and I think it's really useful to go through some examples and see how these worked, just to get a feel for what analog computation is about. And ultimately to see that that received view just isn't quite right if you actually look at what analog computers were doing. So there were mechanical analog computers, which used moving parts, usually metal. There were electronic analog computers that were just made of circuits, and electromechanical that used both. So here's an example. I really like this example. This is a mechanical multiplier. This video is taken from a training video from the US Navy in the early 50s, I believe. And the Navy had a bunch of really intricate mechanical computers to solve certain problems where you're on a ship, you're in the Navy. There's an enemy ship, it's over there. And you would like to be able to shoot the enemy ship. That's a complicated problem, because you have to take into account the fact that your ship is moving at a particular speed in a particular direction. The enemy ship is moving at a particular speed, particular direction. When you fire your shell, it's going to take some time to get there, and the time's going to depend on, the wind speed and all that. That's a calculation that takes too long for anyone to do by hand, so they built these very interesting mechanical computers to solve that problem very, very quickly. And so these videos just showed how the basic elements worked. So let's look at this mechanical multiplier. You can easily see what it does, right? Just kidding. We'll look at it in pieces. What it has here, we have two inputs, A and B, and we'll take it apart and look at them in pieces. This is the output over here. So here's A, and A slides up and down, and this is a fixed pivot point. So as A slides up and down, this armature rotates about that pivot point, right? And it's a fixed pivot point, it doesn't move. B slides back and forth this way, and it's connected to that armature with a pin that moves, it slides. So as A moves, it slides up and down. As B moves, it slides back and forth. It's limited to that groove that's in the armature connected to A. That pin drives the output. So as that pin moves, that drives the output, okay? It's not obvious why it's a multiplier just yet, but you can see how mechanically these pieces move. Now, when those two pins are lined up, everything is zero. That'll make sense in just a second. So they're lined up, and now we can put some numbers along A, along B, along our output. So there's 0, positive and negative, 0, positive and negative, 0, positive and negative. Now what happens is as we move the inputs, there's 2. As B moves to 3, our output is 6. Guess what? 2 times 3 is 6, right? Now we can move our input A to 4, move B to 4, and our output is positive 16. Go through just a couple more examples here. So we'll move B to 0, now the output's 0. And you can see mechanically, once you get a feel for how the parts work, you can see why this works. When A is at 0, no matter where B goes, the output's going to stay at 0. And similarly for B. And it works for negative numbers too. When A is negative 3, B is positive 4, the output is negative 12. Okay? So that's a mechanical analog computer. And like I said, the reason it's mechanical is we have pieces that are physically moving around, right? There's another kind of mechanical component to an analog computer, a little bit more complicated, describing what it does, but simpler in operation. So a simple kind of relatively simple thing that we might want to do in engineering and mathematics is we have some kind of a curve, right, that describes the rate of change, how something changes. Like maybe this is speed. So this is the speed of the car. But we don't really care about the speed. What we want to do is figure out the distance, right? So what that means is we need to integrate this function. It's the slightly gray shaded part that you can see here, right? So what we want to do is find out the integral of this function over time. And this was the machine to do it. This is a simplified version of a mechanical integrator. So the way this works, I'll start in a second. This is a turntable. And once we start the computer, it's just going to rotate constantly at a constant speed. And then it's connected, here's 2 steel ball bearings, and it's connected to this roller right here. And the input is it's going to move back and forth here. So what that input's going to do, it's going to trace that black line, the value of our function. And don't worry about the labels, those don't really matter. But once this thing starts going at a constant speed, the further this is to the edge, the faster these rollers are going to go. And when it's close to the middle, when it's right at the middle, it won't rotate at all. So we can vary where this is back and forth, and you can see it'll make the roller go faster or slower. And then what we can do is count the rotations. Now it's rotating fast, so that's when our function is a high value. And then when it moves back toward the center, see it's going slower and slower and slower. And when it's right at the middle, it's 0. So now it's not adding anything. And then it goes back, and then makes the roller roll again. So that's a way to integrate our function. Now, if we put a lot of these together, this is the mechanical integrator or differential analyzer that Vannevar Bush made in, this picture is from 1931. This is a joke I have to say in this talk always. If you don't remember anything from this talk, remember that this guy's name was Vannevar, not Vannevar. Vannevar rhymes with achiever, which he was. He went on later to start the National Science Foundation and did a lot of important things. But one of them was the invention of this differential analyzer. So now for an electronic example, to motivate this, I'll talk about a very basic problem in physics. Sorry about the equations. They don't matter too much, but there they are. So this is the kind of problem it's called the spring mass problem, and it's the kind of thing you'd see in a physics textbook or a differential equations textbook. The idea is we've got this mass that's sitting on the ground, and it's connected to a wall, and there's a spring right there. And we want to know what happens if we push that mass and let it go, or if we pulled that mass and let it go. Well, it's connected by a spring, so it's going to wobble a little bit and then go back to its starting point, right? Its equilibrium point. But it's a little bit complicated because that depends on this K, how springy the spring is, and it also depends on how sticky the floor is, the friction of the floor. Well, this is a well-known problem, and you can just set up some equations to describe it, and you can solve it. Not that big of a deal. But when we have these equations, what we can do is build this electronic circuit to solve those equations and show what happens. So this is the kind of thing, a very small example of what most people are familiar with when they think of analog electronic computers, if they think about them at all. But the idea is you take this equation, and from that equation you can directly create a circuit that does what this equation says. And again, the details don't matter, but the idea is take these equations and you turn them into a circuit that solves your problem for you. So for this particular example, if we ran that and we measured the voltage at the output, turns out it goes down and then it wiggles a little bit, and then it goes to equilibrium, just like we'd expect, right? Now if we put a bunch of those things together, we get an analog computer, so this is the full system. This is actually the very same analog computer that was the opening image that I showed. And if you look carefully, this engineer is testing it by doing a problem very much like what I just showed you. You can kind of see the triangles in the circuit diagram there. Okay, so those two examples, fast and furious, I know, the details don't matter too much, but they're very much in line with this idea that analog is about continuous things, smooth things. Those mechanical components, they move smoothly. And the electronics, very smoothly, right? There aren't gaps or discontinuities. But that's where things get more interesting if you actually look at, you do some research into analog computers. This is a nice quotation. 99 and 44 100ths% of the time, when an engineer speaks of an analog computer, he is referring to an electronic differential analyzer, an EDA, the kind of thing we just looked at. But the EDA is just one type of analog computer, one specific application of the general principle of computation by analogy. So let's see first of all what is meant by analogy and how we use analogs in computation in the general sense, not just the EDA. And so here's where things get a little bit interesting. If you look at some analog textbooks, you find ways that these engineers who built analog computers use different kinds of circuits to make discontinuous functions. So here are just 4 examples. This is an absolute value function that has a little discontinuity right there. The bang-bang function is what it was called, a soft limiter function. This is a zero limiting function where we'll just talk about this one. This is a function where all the inputs are 0 when, all the outputs are 0 when the inputs are negative, but then after that it's just a straight line. Okay, so that's interesting, but what would you use those things for? Well, I just showed you this example where we had this mathematical characterization, right? We had this physics problem basically, and I said, just trust me, here's how you set it up with equations. But what do you do if you don't have a mathematical characterization? What if I just drew this? I don't know how to describe that mathematically. What if I want to study that? And I don't know how to set up equations, so I can't do that with an analog computer? Well, no, it's no problem. Such behavior presents almost insurmountable obstacles to purely mathematical investigation, but poses no particular difficulty to analog computer investigation. Again, we're not solving equations, we're modeling systems. Thus, if we can describe the input-output relationship, all we need to do is provide an element on the computer which has the same relationship between its input and output voltages. These elements are known as arbitrary function generators. Big mouthful again, I'm just trying to be complete. But here's the idea. We've got this arbitrary function. I know it's arbitrary because I drew it. And we don't know how to characterize that mathematically. So what can we do? Well, we could do some complicated mathematics and come up with a way to approximate this. I'll say something about that in a second. But maybe you don't want to do that. So what do? You use an arbitrary function generator, and you make a little discrete, piecewise approximation to it. And then you can use that to do whatever you wanted to do with your analog computer, right? So this is one way in which it's just wrong to think analog computers were all about continuous functions. Here's a little discrete one. It gets better. Sometimes in life, as I'm sure you know, you want to study something that has a step function. And this is a function where it's at some value and then it just jumps to another value. And importantly, it doesn't go between. It goes from one value and then just steps to another value and then steps to another value, right? Another completely discrete, discontinuous function. Turns out analog computers did this too. So here's an example of an electromechanical component that would do just that. So here's how this works. This is a little rotating thing that would contact this resistor at various places. Again, if you're not an electronics geek, it's okay. You'll get the point. So this thing rotates counterclockwise. It makes contact here, and then there's a little gap where it doesn't make contact. And then it makes contact here, and another little gap. And it makes contact here, which goes down to this part of the resistor, and then this one, and then this one. So it's mechanical because it physically moves, but it's electronic because what's doing the representing is a voltage, right? Not the angle or anything like that, not like the mechanical computers we saw earlier, but it is still a voltage. So as it rotates, the voltage it produces is a genuine step function. So it looks something like this. It produces a step function that we want. And if we want to alter the values here, we just use a different circuit, or we can speed up the rotation, right? There are many things we could do with this. But this produces a genuine step function. So this is, again, an example of an analog computer that's really using something that's completely discrete. So why not use an approximation? Mathematically, we know we can do this. So this is an even simpler step function. It just goes back and forth between two variables. Why not just do an approximation to this using a continuous function? It would look like this. This is a very simple way to do it using some sines and cosines. Why not just do that? Then we don't have to mess with all this, weird mechanical business. Well, it's another big quotation I'll throw at you. For the problem being studied, it's not immediately obvious why that relay is needed, the relay being the rotating step function I showed you. The voltage from a continuous circuit can be made to closely approximate a step function, but there are reasons why this isn't practical. So the slope of the step function out of the circuit isn't exactly zero after the original discontinuity, and in the process of adding two of these step functions, a small error that increases with time will be applied to the integrator and cause an unwanted drift to the output of the integrator. Jargony way of saying those little errors right here, especially at the ends, those add up quickly in ways that are undesirable, right? So it's better, don't approximate a step function, just implement one in your analog computer. Okay, so again, this received view where analog computer is about continuous variables, that just isn't going to work, right? Because there are these discrete things. And this was not something that's, weird, exotic examples. This is the kind of thing you find in virtually every analog textbook once you get past chapter 5, right? This was well known. So there's a better view, and this is where philosophers do some work in trying to figure out, okay, what's actually going on here? What were these engineers and scientists really getting at? And so this is what I think is the right way to think about analog computation. It's analog computation involving analog representation. That almost sounds circular, but it's not. I just have to tell you what analog representation is. And this is the kind of thing that I think you're actually going to agree with as soon as I give you some examples. The jargony view is analog representation is representation in which the thing being represented just varies monotonically with what's doing the representing. Jargon. Better way to understand this is examples. So here are 3 uncontroversial examples of analog computation. Analog representation. Not computation, representation. At least I hope they're not controversial. So on the left, we have an analog thermometer. It's an analog representation of temperature. Why? As the temperature goes up, the height of the mercury or the alcohol literally goes up, right? And it's this monotonic relationship. It's linear. So one goes up, the other goes up, right? So one goes down, the other one goes down. Vinyl records. That's a little bit more complicated because with stereo records, there's like 2 sets of grooves. But the idea is there's kind of a mirroring relationship. As the pitch of a sound goes up, if you look at the sound waves, they're closer together. And if you look with a microscope at the grooves of the record, that's what happens too, right? And maybe one of the more important examples is an analog clock. So focusing just on the seconds of the analog clock. Why is it analog, according to me? Because as time increases, the angle of the second hand increases, right? And this is true whether or not the second hand goes in discrete ticks, or if it sweeps continuously. Like a lot of clocks that plug into the wall, they sweep continuously. A lot of analog watches go in discrete ticks. And to me, it just doesn't matter whether it's doing it discretely or continuously. What matters is this relationship between what it's representing, time in seconds, and the physical thing doing the representing. Right? So just to be really clear about this, here is my analog thermometer. Here it's about 25 degrees. Here it's 90 degrees. I hope you'll agree with me that this is literally taller than this, right? Here's a digital representation of 25 degrees. Pretend that's on your favorite digital thermometer. And here's 90. These two numerals are not, in any sense, literally larger than these two numerals. What they represent is, right? I mean, I could have made this in a bigger font to make it like a fake example, right? Could have made it in a smaller font. But these aren't larger. The representation itself is not larger. What it represents is, but that's different than this. This one is literally larger, and that's what I think the essence of analog computation is, or analog representation. Okay, so what about brains? Switch gears a little bit, and I'll tell you briefly what this has to do with brains. So going back to this McCulloch and Pitts article, they start off saying, because of the all or none character of nervous activity, neural events and their relations among them can be treated by means of propositional logic, what we would now call digital logic. This is a very popular idea, and this is something that is still taught in neuroscience classes. So the idea is we have a bunch of neural spikes. Neural spikes are the things that neurons send out, right? Sometimes called action potentials, and they can vary a little bit, from different ones, but that variance doesn't matter. All that matters is there one or isn't there one? So we can treat it as just like a kind of binary code. There's a 1, 0, 0, 1, 0, 1. And so the idea has been, this is a deep analogy between the way brains work and the way digital computers work. But we've also known that, even if that really is the way neural spikes work, and they don't, I'll show you why in a second, the way that neurons do what they do then must have to do with how fast they generate these spikes. And so this is a place where I think it's a really clear example of an analog representation. And most neuroscientists, when you point this out to them, they're like, oh yeah, that is right. So here's a classic experiment where we have here, this is just a muscle with increasing amounts of weight. And there are sensory neurons that pay attention to how much weight is on there. And as you can see, the more weight there is, the more spikes there are. And so basically, the faster the neuron fires, the greater the weight. And that's an analog representation. We have the thing doing the representing is the neuron, it's spiking. And the thing it's representing is increasing weight. And as one increases, the other increases, right, in this analog representation. So that's one way that neuroscientists have been talking about analog representation this whole time. And it doesn't matter that these things are discrete little events and they're not continuous. So this is just kind of a close-up picture of different neural spikes. And if you look at one to another, sometimes one's a little bit taller than another one, or sometimes one is a little bit wider than another one. But the idea has been, it's just like a digital computer. It doesn't matter what that exact shape is. All that matters is there one or isn't there one? A 1 or a 0. But very, very recent research, this is an article from this year, is showing that this might not be quite right. Those tiny little differences do make a difference. We just haven't been able to measure that difference until very recently. So here, this is a review article from Frontiers in Cellular Neuroscience from April of this year, where they talk about this very phenomenon. And so the basic idea here is these are just some different neural spikes kind of laid on top of each other. And you can see some of them are really tall, and they get shorter, and they flatten out. And the effect they have downstream matters. So this red one over here is kind of taller, and it has a bigger effect than this blue one, which is like right there. So that shape actually does matter. So that's much more like analog computation than digital computation. And let me talk about one quick example, because kind of a higher level psychological example, because we're running out of time. This is a very famous experiment by Shepard and Metzler. There's a psychologist in the audience. He's nodding his head. Former teacher of mine. This is an experiment that they gave to people where your task is to figure out, are those two shapes the same or are they different? And what same means is, could you take one and rotate it in space so it's exactly the same as the other one? Are these ones the same? Yes. Yeah. If you kind of look at this one, well, whichever one you want, if you look at this one, you can imagine kind of turning it 90 degrees, and then it matches that one, right? These two, are those the same or different? I mean, you know I didn't put it up there, unless it's going to be different. Yeah, these are different because the one is the mirror image of the other. There's no way to rotate it so it matches that one, right? So that's kind of interesting. And if you're like most people, when you did that in your head, you kind of imagined really rotating one and kind of checking to see if it matched, right? And what Shepard and Metzler found is if you plot the response time of people doing this task, if you show them two ones that are exactly the same, they're not rotated at all, it takes 1 second. It just takes a little bit of time to just, push the button and make the judgment. But as you rotate them more and more with respect to each other, it takes more and more time to do this task. So it's as if, it takes more time to, if you were to physically rotate them and check, but it seems like something in your head is, metaphorically speaking, actually rotating to check and see if they're the same. And so this is the kind of result that people in psychology have said, this is evidence for an analog representation, because it's not just doing it in one step the way a digital computer would do it. We have to go through all the steps or all the in-between steps as we're kind of mentally rotating that picture. So it's 7:50. I'm about out of time. I'll go ahead and wrap up. Got several things to skip here. I was going to talk more about what's really cool about analog and digital representation, but I'll leave some time for Q&A. So let me just skip to my last slide here, where I say, to me, the cool thing about analog representation, and thus analog computation, is that it takes advantage of, and rather than abstracts away from, the physicality of representations. It uses the physicality of representations rather than abstracting away from it, which is what digital computers and digital representation does. And so that may well be the kind of computation that brains evolved to perform. And that's good news, because it makes sense of this idea that brains could literally compute in a principled way that we once understood intimately, but we just don't anymore. And so if all we think about, if what we think about when we think about computation is just digital computation, it doesn't seem like brains could possibly be computers. They just don't really work like that at all. But if we allow ourselves to think of computation in terms of analog computation, it really might be that brains are analog computers. But that's for the neuroscientists to find out. All right, so thank you very much for coming. I appreciate your attention. That's my email address and website. And I have to say that this material was partially supported by the National Science Foundation, so thanks to them too.
If you have questions, I'll come by with a microphone. And for people on live stream, if you type your question in. And if you could also, if you're watching remotely, type in your location so we know where you're from. We'll start up here.
Hi.
This is so far out of my knowledge base, but is this analog function almost like a vector that has magnitude and direction?
Sometimes, yes. So abstractly, you can think of what neurons are doing as vector operations. Yeah, that's a little bit more abstract from what I was talking about, but that is a way to think of it, yeah.
this is a little bit more down to earth.
Okay.
A few years ago, in my office, I had analog telephones,
Oh, yeah.
and they had all kinds of wires.
Uh-huh.
And then when they went to digital, they went to one separate little wire. And explain that to me.
I wish that I had to show you an image of an analog, a real analog program. I was just at the Computer History Museum in Mountain View, California, or maybe it's Menlo Park, whatever, somewhere near Stanford, Bay Area. And for these analog computers, let me show you again the very first slide. The way you would program these things is connect a whole bunch of wires into these various components, right? Because you literally had to have a connection to every single component that you wanted to use, right? And so an analog program would be a huge set of, this mess of wires. And rather than unplugging those and plugging them back in every time, people found out it was better, because you wanted to use the same program maybe different times, they would make a board that had all of those connections and then just stick the board on there, right? But it was because with the analog computers, again, it's this idea that the representations take advantage of the physicality. There has to be a physical connection to the points, the places that you want it to be. Whereas with a digital computer, you can abstract away from that level. And I assume this is somewhat the case with telephone systems too. I'm not an expert in telephone systems. But you don't have to make the physical connections with wires. It can be abstracted in kind of something like a software layer.
So what you're describing is what we were taught our freshman year in college.
Good.
Second comment, I knew a young woman several years ago had never studied math, but you could show her extremely complicated problems and she would just give you the answer automatically with no thought whatsoever.
Wow.
Is that analog? Is that digital?
Probably closer to analog. And let me connect that a little bit to one of the things that I think, I don't know if this is for better or worse, but it's lost. When you read a lot of these analog technical manuals, people talked about when you're working in a problem, because you had to manipulate this physical device, you got a real feel for the problem. And one of the things that people didn't like in the switch from analog computers to digital computers is you didn't have that same kind of feel. It was too abstract. Whereas with the analog machines, you really had to finesse things, and sometimes they would be sensitive to, things that you wouldn't think they should be sensitive to. And so for a lot of those people, it helped, obviously, to have a good mathematical background, but people would get so good at using analog computers that they would just know how to tweak things to get the kind of solution that they wanted, rather than having to go back to the math and figure it out and then redesign everything.
All right.
Yeah.
And then my real question is, you talked about analog, Turing, and digital computing.
Yes.
What is quantum computing?
Quantum computing that means different things to different people. Sometimes it's digital in the sense that the quantum states are just representing digits, but this is outside of my area of expertise. Sometimes it seems like the way that those are manipulated is it takes advantage of some of the continuous properties of quantum mechanical systems. And so the frank answer is I don't know, but it seems like it's both to me. Sometimes they mean it in a digital way, sometimes they mean it in an analog way. Yeah.
So is there a third concept? Hang on, George. It's going to be dead air if you don't get a microphone.
So is there possibly a third state? We have now multiple dimensions. Is there analog and digital and something else?
I think so. There's a lot of research now. There's a community of researchers doing what they call unconventional and natural computing. And what they mean is using things that we find in nature, all kinds of various things like slime molds and different molecules to perform computations. And it seems like they mean something very abstract. What they mean is just general symbol manipulation. So the kind of thing that Chomsky would have been happy to call computation, where you have some symbols, they represent something, who knows what, and they're just manipulated into other symbols. And then those symbols represent something else, who knows what. So that's neither analog nor digital. Yeah.
All right, Professor Maley, we have a question towards the back of the room.
How come we, as you said, our brains were analog computers, right?
They might
well,
be.
It's so much easier for computers to go ahead and perceive bigger numbers. Like, well, it's easier for us to perceive bigger numbers because they only think in zeros and ones. But how come we, as analog computers, created digital computers? I mean, each has its own perks, but...
Yeah. If I had more time, I would go through some of the slides where I showed you a comparison between what analog computers do well and what digital computers do well. I mean, the reason that we built digital computers is because they're good at some of the things that we're not, right? So if you wanted to add two numbers and those numbers have 1 billion digits, it's going to take you a really, really long time to add those numbers. And if you tried, you'd probably make a mistake somewhere because we're error prone, that happens. Whereas a computer would do it very, very quickly and without errors. So the short answer is they're just better at some things than we are. Hi, Nick.
Hey. So when you were talking about thermometers and this sort of dependency relation between this representation, right? So what I saw there was like the beginnings of a theory of intentionality or aboutness. So is that where you're going there? And can you talk about that and possibly any implications for like broad versus narrow mental content?
So that is a philosophical jargony question. The short answer is representation is a really, really hard problem that philosophers have tried to tackle. What makes something a representation versus not? I do not have an answer for that very hard problem. What I do have an answer for is, in slogan form, you give me a representation and I can tell you whether it's digital or analog or something else entirely. But I can't tell you in general what counts as a representation. So that's the short answer. I don't know, well, I'm just not going to talk about the other implications because we can do that some other time. But that's the short answer.
All right, we have a question towards the back of the room on your
Okay.
right here.
Would Nyquist-Shannon just say to sample more based on the brain cell view? I think you were kind of showing that on the discrete.
That's another kind of technical question. So the Nyquist-Shannon theorem has to do with things that they have a lower bound on how much information they can carry because we have roughly speaking, we have some oscillating thing, right? Like think of FM radio. We have a signal and it just oscillates. But when those oscillations are faster, when it's more compressed, that means something, and when they're farther apart, that means something else, right? But we know those oscillations can only get so close together because that's the way the system is engineered. That's why that theorem makes sense at all. That theorem just doesn't apply for natural systems that don't have like a carrier frequency. Yeah.
Okay, one of the differences I'd noticed between the analog and digital is when you plug in a computation into digital and you get 17 decimal points of accuracy. You plug that into an analog, you get close.
Yep.
You get something that you have to look at the number, look at your result, understand what you're getting, and realize, is it good enough? Is that
Exactly.
one reason why that is kind of, analog has kind of faded away?
Yeah, so historically, when analog computers were the computers that you could buy, I mean, that's what everyone used. Digital computers came on the scene and they were too slow. No one liked them because analog computers were just faster. But then they got faster and faster, and then exactly what you say, the digital computers, once we had enough digits, they could do as, they could be as accurate as you want. Now we have scientific software packages that can easily generate pi to, 1 million digits if you want, right? So historically, yeah, that's why analog computers fell out of favor, because they just weren't as accurate. But, I'm not saying we should all throw away our digital computers and, get analog computers instead. But if you just want to understand what computation is, this is a whole separate kind of computation that, is really understudied. And a very general question that I just hinted at here is, what is it about analog computation and digital computation, maybe Turing computation, what makes those all the same thing? What makes those all computation, such that those three kinds are a species of the same thing? I have some ideas about that, but that's, come to the next talk for that.
A comment, something you said earlier about the difference between the speed of doing it in analog versus doing digital, and why we move in a continuity, or we move towards the digital oftentimes. A good example of that is, say, in cartooning and animation, okay, where if you can compare what Disney was doing back in the 1930s in terms of drawing a cartoon, the number of hours and so on. When you apply digital techniques to that and, building a digital model for doing the rendering and so on, you can do it so much faster. Okay,
Yeah.
so I think that the economics oftentimes will drive moving from the analog to the digital.
Absolutely, and that's exactly what happened. There was no good reason to continue to develop analog computers when, from an engineering and scientific perspective, you could do everything you wanted to with the digital computers, and you could do it faster and eventually cheaper. That's right, yeah. But part of what I wanted to at least gesture at was to say, that is no reason to think that what's happening in our brains is digital. I mean, there's a certain kind of way of looking at history, the kind of Whiggish view of history, I'm told, where you might think, well, analog computation is just kind of a historical curiosity, but not something we should really care about, because clearly digital computation is better. But I want to say it's just different. And yeah, it's the technology that replaced analog computation, but if what you want to do, like me, as a philosopher, is understand what is this thing called computation, and why is it that people say these artifacts do it and brains do it, what could they possibly be talking about? Well, I want to have access to all the possible answers, even the ones that, for economic reasons have fallen by the wayside. Right. Other questions?
We have an online question.
Oh, great.
From Lamont. In the brain, do you look at synapses firing? Is that when computations are happening?
I don't look at anything because I'm not a scientist. I look at what the scientists do and try to figure out what they're talking about. But yes, so at the, there are neurons, brain cells connected to other brain cells, and that point of contact is the synapse, right? And so you can look at, there's an electrical signal that goes, the spike that I mentioned. That is what most neuroscientists consider the sort of basic unit of computation. So generally speaking, yes, I think that's the place to look. And then like digital computers, that's the very bottom level, like the ones and zeros of digital computers. But then there might be abstractions upon abstractions upon abstractions. But if you really want to know what's happening, you've got to understand at the base level too, right? You can do investigations in all sorts of areas, but if you want to know what's happening at the lowest level, well, you have to look there. Yeah.
Right, we have a question up front here, and due to the time, let's make this the last question this evening.
The one thing that as you speak about digital computers, as you speak about digital computers, the one thing that strikes me though is at their core, at a physical level, a digital computer is analog. There's an overshoot that happens when it changes voltage. There is no instantaneous change.
Yes.
And in fact, you showed by showing analog doing discontiguous functions, you showed that an analog computer can emulate a digital computer.
Yes, that's exactly right.
So at the end of the day, it's really all the same. It's a physical property.
Yeah, so, and that's a common thing that people say. The one thing that I will say though, at the level the sort of bottom level where we consider it to be a digital machine, right? It is true that if we measured the voltages, it's going to look like that approximation where it wiggles, right? But we've designed the circuitry so that those wiggles don't matter, right? What matters is it near 0 volts? That counts as a 0. Is it near 5 volts? That counts as a 1, right? And so, although it is continuous at that lowest level, once we go up a level, it's zeros and ones, right? And there we just treat it as completely discrete, right? Whereas with analog computers, it's not like that, right? The actual voltage is what's doing the representing, right? So yeah, it kind of looks the same, but there's a really important fundamental difference, right? So one quick example, for a digital computer, if you're going to represent the number 7, it'd be a 0, 1, 1, 1, right? And what that would really look like is one circuit element that has 0 volts, another one that has around 5, another one that has around 5, and another one that has around 5. If you want to represent 7 in an analog computer, 7 volts, right? It's not an abstraction, it's just measure the volts. That's the number, right? Whereas with the digital computer, yeah, there's voltages, but those are abstracted at the level of it being digital. Yeah, so it's an important point that I ran out of time to talk about, but yeah, I appreciate that.
Well, thank you, Professor Maley, for a wonderful talk. And thank you for attending tonight's program. Remember lindahall.org, and I hope to see you at a future event. Thank you, and good night.